I do want to ask Lynn a question that comes from the members of the LaRouche movement in South Africa. And I ask this specifically because it reflects so many questions that we have gotten in, really from all over Africa, from contacts and supporters and government officials there. The question is as follows. It says, in 1652, Jan van Riebeck and his entourage of settlers of Dutch descent disembarked on the southern part of Africa to establish a halfway station for the Dutch East India Company. This was to make available fresh food for the ships that were destined for India to buy spices. This was indeed the beginning of the colonization of South Africa. Since that day, we have fallen under the British Empire's tentacles. For more than 300 years, up to this day, Africa is still under the rule of what you have referred to as the British Empire. Our nations have no sovereignty at all. Some leaders in the past, like Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara, tried standing up against the empire, but they were killed in short order. How do we on the African continent join with you, Mr. LaRouche, in carrying out your policies, such as the Four-Power Agreement, the Eurasian Land Bridge, and food security for all, so that we here in Africa can be partners with you and the rest of the world in getting rid of the British Empire and having the possibility of living our lives as human beings and not as cattle?
Well, since I'm 88 years of age, nearly, that my promises on long-term actions from me are limited accordingly. And therefore, however, I can speak of perspectives and policies which are transportable even if I'm dead. And that's not because I mean to put a grim note on it, but that's the fact of the matter. I'm stubborn. I may live for another 10, 15 years, you know. I'm one of those stubborn types that do that sort of thing. But I wouldn't guarantee it, I'll tell you that. So the question here is, how are we going to settle this question of Africa? You're not going to settle it by trying to bargain with Africa. You're going to settle it by getting the United States back under a Glass-Steagall system. And right now, that will do it. You see, we have, in a sense, you know, our so-called African-American population is a mess at the present. It's had better times than now. But it's problematic. What we have to do is we have to say, we have, as a United States, as a leading nation of the world, if we become that again by doing what has to be done with the sort of our John McCain and his associates, if we do that, we're going to have an opportunity. We're going to be again the top dog in the world, politically. Not by physical force, but politically. And people will want to join with us because the alternative, being eaten by the British, is not very palatable. So therefore, we have to say, what are we going to do with potential allies available right now, Russia, China, India, and other countries, and some countries in Europe, to say we're going to do something about this Africa colonization business. It's a disgusting, immoral thing, and practically it has to be changed. Therefore, what will we do to deliver to African nations the sovereignty which they are denied? Don't come on there with a plan of how you're going to tell them to free themselves. Get serious. We have to have a commitment as a nation with certain other nations to say, this imperial nonsense ends. Well, the first thing to do is you agree on bankrupting the British system, because that's your problem. There is an empire in the world today which is best identified as the British Empire because it is associated with certain interests which associate themselves with the image of the British Empire, typified by the Inter-Alpha Group. which is one of the most significant arms of the British Empire on the planet in terms of finances, and is the key architect of this mess that's happened with Brazil, with Greece. So therefore, the destruction of the British Empire is the first step required. Otherwise, no freedom of Africa. That's simple. So let's destroy the British Empire. We have now in our hands, if provided we get this Glass-Steagall reform through, we will have the power in our hands to do precisely that. So let's do it. Now, what does that mean? That means we make a commitment to certain projects. First of all, reforms of currencies and things like that they want done. So therefore, we will take and say, what does Africa need? Well, you take a photograph of all the areas of Africa at nighttime and look how many parts of Africa have light at nighttime. And you find very few. So all the talk about the success of this part, of that part of Africa is immediately shown to you by the right helicopter ride across the territory of Africa. There are very few places where there are lights at night visible at helicopter level. So therefore, what we need, Africa has a large potential for agriculture, which is it has a large potential for agriculture, which is most important because that is what affects most of the people who live in Africa, is their agricultural potential. Not much in terms of food, but in terms of potential. Now, what you need to develop that potential is infrastructure. Now, to deliver the infrastructure required, you've got to open up high-speed rail or magnetic levitation types of lines going from the Middle East into Africa that way, as Sudan, to take and expand Lake Chad, to restore it to a full strength as what it was in ancient times, which fixes Chad. And that's done by taking some water from Zaire, across Zaire, moving it into Lake Chad, expanding Lake Chad, and suddenly this desolate country of Chad, which has no perspective whatsoever, begins to have a very significant perspective. And since it's a keystone country in terms of geographic position, as between Sudan and West Africa, it's very important. It also has a connection with respect to Congo. Okay, I was distracted. Right. So now the other thing you have to have is, of course, you have to have the railroad system. Water systems, railway systems. Then you have to build an infrastructural system. In other words, you've got farmers. The first thing you're going to do to maintain the economy, you're going to get African agriculture back in business. You're going to give it all the assistance, right? You're going to provide the infrastructure with that purpose in mind. And you have some areas which have been destroyed by the British recently, as in the mountain areas there. But so you get that going, and then you can say, by the defining projects, using existing governments as political entities, and getting a system of cooperation among these governments with water projects, with power projects, and so forth. This kind of thing creates the basis for giving real structure to Africa. And if you've got a commitment for a couple of generations to further this project, which we can, in the meantime, Africa as a food basket, when it's brought up to strength, is crucial for the feeding of Europe. So Africa, exports of African food products are a big opportunity for Africa and for Europe. And you have mineral developments there, and you can, around the basis of an agricultural culture, you can develop the mineral resources in Africa. In other words, what they do now is they go into Africa, they find a mine someplace, they rape it, put the contents in a bag, and go to the port and run overseas with the content of the bag. The normal process of using the raw material resources inside a continent and using it in a stepwise project of upgrading it from one step to the other, partly for consumption and partly for export, which is a normal thing. But in Africa, they just go in there and take the thing, rip it out of the ground, and carry it off someplace else and sell it on the world market. So if you give them a development perspective and are prepared to guarantee by solid agreements among nations to restore Africa to full independence, you can do it. You have to be patient, you have to be loving, but you can do it. And that's what we have to do. And what we need also is, on the inside, we need more recruitment of Africans who, while defending their own national sovereignty as nations, will also become a cooperating cadre force across national borders as an African interest group to make sure that Africa has cooperation and means of expressing that to the world at large. So you need an African institution of, the revolutionary Africans, the ones that really want to build their country and develop it. And that's the way you do it. I don't see any other way to do it.
I do want to ask Lynn a question that comes from the members of the LaRouche movement in South Africa. And I ask this specifically there. The question is as follows. It says, in 1652, Jan van Riebeck and his entourage of settlers of Dutch descent. This was indeed the beginning of the colonization of South Africa. Since that day, we have fallen under the British Empire's tentacles. For more than 3 embarked on the southern part of Africa to establish a halfway station for the Dutch East India Company. This was to make available fresh food for the ships that were destined for India to buy spice, because it reflects so many questions that we have gotten in, really from all over Africa, from contacts and supporters and government officials.